1 week season.
Hello, friends and Inner Circle fam. Hope you had a good 3-day weekend if your company recognized Veterans Day yesterday. Usually we reserve this time for roster reviews with me, but this week we're going to change it up again. We're going to do a first week for a look for week 11 like we did last week, discussing some kind of player pool and process. Had a lot of positive feedback on last week's show, a lot of requests to do it again this week. So we're going to dive in here with a week 11 first look. So for me, every week, I kind of start my process on Tuesday. I open up the DK app on my phone and I go game by game, position by position, just kind of noting my initial thoughts. So you can find those thoughts. They'll be pinned in the Discord as well as on Twitter, probably later today or tomorrow. So the first game we have when we open up DraftKings here is the Packers at the Bears. So on paper, not really a great spot for Jordan Love. There's only one quarterback, Jaden Daniels, threw for more than 260 yards. And only one quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, accounted for more than one touchdown against the Bears. So just really not a great on-paper spot for Love, and he's expensive. On the ground, matchup's pretty middling for both Josh Jacobs and Swift. Neither of them really kind of stand out here initially. Josh Jacobs averaging less than 3 targets a game kind of makes it hard to get excited for him at his $7K price tag. He's only got one game this season with more than 21 DraftKings points, which is like not even a 3K salary multiplier. And then kind of through the air, Nico Collins, the only wide receiver to post a 25-point game. Gabe Davis actually had a 21-point outing against the Bears, but that included 2 touchdowns. And those are the only scores above 20 points against the Bears. And just kind of, with how inept the Bears have looked on offense lately, for me, this is probably a game I'll likely avoid entirely. But again, a first look, we'll do a deeper dive later in the week, but just kind of first pass, that's kind of how I see this Packers at Bears game. Next game here on the app is the Jags at the Lions. So I guess my first thought here on this game is if Mac Jones is under center again, I'll definitely be drawn to the Lions defense. Jones struggled mightily last week while he was at home against the Vikings. Lions are just as good a defense, and the Jags are on the road this week. So obviously that's a defense I'll likely be drawn to. Both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs both have 8 touchdowns on the season. This is probably a spot where Montgomery is more interesting to me here. He's a little bit cheaper, and it's likely a game that the Lions are going to control throughout. So, he's only seeing 15. I think he's only had 15 or more touches 4 times all season. So it's 6,500. It's probably a spot where if I play Montgomery, I'm probably going to play him or pair him with the Lions defense, kind of in a game where Detroit just kind of curb stomps Jacksonville. Through the air, Jared Goff hasn't put up a 4x salary score once this season. And that's despite the fact that the Lions have played 3 games where they scored 42 or more offensive points. So it just doesn't seem like he has 30-point upside in this one. So probably not a spot where I'm going to get to Goff. Assuming he's healthy come Sunday, I think the player that probably stands out to me the most on paper is Sam Laporta. He's 4,300. Tight end generally all season has been a pretty thin position. And the Jaguars have allowed an opposing tight end to eclipse at least 70 receiving yards in each of the past 4 games. So a good spot for Laporta here. Moving on to the next game, which is the Raiders at the Dolphins. What really stands out here is Devon A. Chan. J.K. Dobbins, Chuba Hubbard, Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, and Chase Brown all amassed over 110 yards against this Raiders team, and all but Javonte Williams scored at least once. So I think this is a really strong spot for Devon Achane. When you consider his price, he's just underpriced as well. So probably a spot where he's going to see some increased ownership. Through the air here, matchups kind of tough for both Las Vegas and Miami. And while Tyreek Hill and Jaden Waddle are both explosive players, only Deontay Johnson has gone for 100 yards receiving against the Raiders. So outside of Achane, not really a game environment that's catching my eye. And the only piece for Las Vegas that is of initial interest would be Brock Bowers. He's seen 48, 49, 50 targets or so over the past 5 weeks. So he's just kind of being peppered. And again, tight end is a position that's generally pretty thin. So I would consider Brock Bowers here initially. The next game here on the slate is the Rams at the Patriots. And so my first thought when I saw this matchup is I wanted to usually I look running back first, but I'm cheating here. I'm going Drake May's DK price. So spoiler alert, here he's 5,600. He's facing the Rams, who will be traveling cross country on a short week after playing the Monday Night Football game for a 10 a.m. Pacific start for them. So definitely a spot where I'm interested in Drake May. The Rams have allowed both mobile quarterbacks they faced this season, Kyler Murray and Brock Purdy, to each throw for 260 or more yards and rush for at least 40 yards. And both of them had 3 passing touchdowns as well. So I think on the ground, matchup sets up pretty well here for Kyren Williams. He's averaging, 21 touches a game. He's got 10 touchdowns on the season, so a strong spot for him. And meanwhile, I guess, the Patriots have allowed Tony Pollard, Tank Bigsby, Joe Mixon, Jordan Mason, all to rush for over 100 yards against them. So again, a strong spot for Kyren here. Both Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are also interesting. They're in kind of a middle of the road matchups. Neither stands out like initially, although Puka Nacua probably underpriced for his role. So have some interest there initially. Moving on to the next game, we've got the Browns at the Saints. So I think kind of initial thought here is I'm going to be interested to see how the field handles Alvin Kamara this week. He's seen a ton of opportunity, but the Browns haven't allowed a running back to rush for over 85 yards. And Devin Singletary's 108 total yards on 20 touches is the best game of the season. And the Saints have faced opposing, strong rushing attacks. The Browns have faced strong rushing attacks, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, J.K. Dobbins, and still haven't allowed a strong game against them. So while Kamara's volume is tremendous, the matchup is really tougher than it appears. And Kamara's the most expensive that he's been all season. So, it's an interesting spot. I'm not sure that one I'm initially drawn to early on. However, on the other side of the ball, Nick Chubb really stands out as one of the best plays at running back on the slate. So Chubb coming back from injury, he's seen opportunity counts of 14, 16, and 18 in his 3 games, after basically missing more than a full year. And the Saints have allowed 6 different running backs to amass over 100 and a touchdown against them this season. So it's a spot that I like Chubb. I feel like he's underpriced as well. The matchup's also intriguing for Jameis Winston as the Saints allowed Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield, Justin Herbert, and Kirk Cousins all to exceed 300 total yards against them. And Winston has 40-plus pass attempts in both of his starts this season. So I think it's likely that we're going to see him throw the ball again 40 times potentially here against the Saints. Leading to some initial interest there. I think you could pair him with Nick Chubb as well, who I think is underpriced. But I think the most underpriced player in this game is Cedric Tillman. He's got 32 targets the past 3 weeks since the Browns moved on from Amari Cooper. And he's only 5,300. And so he's probably my favorite stacking partner with Jameis Winston. He just feels underpriced, probably should be a mid 6K player at this point. So moving on to the next game, which is the Ravens at the Steelers. definitely one that has caught my eye. I've written up targeting the Ravens secondary basically every week this year, so that's not going to stop here. So through 10 games, opposing quarterbacks are averaging 314 yards and 2.3 touchdowns against Baltimore. So it's an average fantasy score of 25 DK points. I'll definitely be firing up Russell Wilson here this week. He's sub 6K at that kind of discount 5,900 pricing. So I think he's going to draw some ownership from the field. Opposing wide receivers have absolutely smashed the Ravens with wide receiver ones, again, averaging 27 DK points against Baltimore. So while that does include Jamar Chase's monster performance last week, it also includes Mike Williams' one catch game where he was injured in the first quarter. So, Pickens has seen his price rise to like 7K, but he's also scored 20 or more DK points in 3 of his last 6 games. He's continuing to build chemistry with Russell Wilson. So I do really like him here. He's getting his best, on paper matchup of the year. And I expect the Steelers to be passing at a higher rate than normal in this matchup. It's a nightmare for Najee Harris, as the Ravens have only allowed, I don't know that they've allowed a 60-yard rusher yet this year. So not really a spot I want to target Najee or Jaylen Warren. The ground matchup doesn't really stand out here for Baltimore either. Tyrone Tracy, the only running back to rush for over 88 yards against Pittsburgh, despite the fact that they faced Bijan and Dobbins, Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor. So, it's obviously a matchup that Derrick Henry can succeed in, but it certainly doesn't stand out on paper. And again, he's obviously uber expensive. Through the air, the Steelers have been susceptible to splash plays, as both Darius Slayton and Terry McLaurin had over 100 yards receiving against them the past 2 weeks. So to me, that has some initial interest in Zay Flowers. Certainly here, if I'm going to build around Russ and George Pickens. I think Mark Andrews is also of interest, but I think Zay Flowers probably my favorite bring back in that spot. So the next game on the slate here is the Vikings at the Titans. So ground matchup here is really difficult for Aaron Jones. Outside of Jahmyr Gibbs, who broke off that 70-yard touchdown run, no running back has exceeded 62 rushing yards against the Titans. So not really a spot I'm drawn to Aaron Jones. Tony Pollard on the other side of the ball, a little bit more appealing. He's seen a tremendous workload, at least 20 touches in 5 out of the past 6 games. And the Vikings have allowed Jordan Mason and Gibbs, Kyron Williams, all to amass over 100 yards and a touchdown against them. And those were the 3 backs that saw 16 or more touches against the Vikings. So, obviously there's some risk that the Titans could get completely blown out, but I think Pollard's going to carry low ownership this week. I think he could be a sneaky play if Tennessee keeps the game competitive. I think the matchup's also interesting here for Calvin Ridley, who has seen 49 targets over the past 5 games, so basically averaging 10 targets a game. He's become the primary target with DeAndre Hopkins' departure to Kansas City. And the Vikings have allowed Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Jaden Reed, and Deebo Samuel all to exceed 100 yards against them this season. So, through the air, not a spot that really stands out for either quarterback. Josh Allen's the only quarterback to surpass 206 passing yards against Tennessee this season. So not really drawn here to either quarterback. And the Titans have been stingy to opposing wide receivers. So like outside of Keon Coleman, who had that 57-yard reception on a broken play, no other pass catcher, so wide receiver or tight end, has exceeded 67 receiving yards against the Titans this year. So kind of tempering my initial interest here in Justin Jefferson or Addison. I think Hawkinson is interesting. He's a little cheaper at 4,700. And I think that's a spot he's seeing increased targets, a thin position. Initially, I think there's some interest there, but, not a game that's really standing out to me. upon initial pass. So the next game on the slate here is the Indianapolis Colts visiting the Jets. So from the Colts side of the ball, Joe Flacco is going to be under center again. Kind of leads me to initial interest in Josh Downs. He's seen 9 or more targets in 6 out of his past 7 games. So definitely going to see opportunities. Matchup's a difficult one for Downs, but both George Pickens and Tank Dell exceeded 100 receiving yards, against the Jets in the past 4 weeks. So I think it's a spot that will probably fly under the radar, as Downs is not cheap. He's in the mid 6Ks. For the Jets, the matchup sets up really well for all of their skill position players. Aaron Rodgers, Breece Hall, Devontae Adams, and Garrett Wilson specifically. Colts have allowed 50% of the opposing quarterbacks to account for at least 300 yards. And the quarterbacks that they've kind of kept under that mark were Tyler Huntley, Will Levis, Malik Willis, and CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud, for note, did throw for 285 yards, so not exactly a poor game. So I think this is an interesting spot for Aaron Rodgers. He's averaging 35 pass attempts a game. He's at 5,500. 20 points well within his range of outcomes. And so both Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson have strong on paper matchups. Nico Collins, Rome Odunze, George Pickens, Brian Thomas Jr., and Justin Jefferson all went for over 100 yards against the Colts. And, since coming over from the Chiefs, Devontae Adams has seen 30 targets in his 3 games, with his targets increasing every game as he gets more familiar with the playbook. So he's probably my favorite stacking partner. Obviously, Garrett Wilson would be just as strong, and they're right around the same price. I think $200, $300 difference. So I think that's an interesting spot to consider early on. So the next game here is the Falcons at the Broncos. On the ground, matchup's probably pretty middling here for Bijan Robinson. He's seeing elite usage lately, but no running back has put up a 4X, like their salary score against Denver this season. And they faced Derrick Henry and Kamara and Dobbins, Breece Hall, Najee Harris, Chuba Hubbard, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker. So kind of a murderer's row of running backs. And really held them all under kind of a tournament winning score. So probably not a spot I'm going to target Bijan Robinson here. Outside of Zay Flowers, who went for 127 yards and 2 touchdowns. So Zay Flowers had a really strong game. But outside of him, no other wide receiver has exceeded either 6 catches or 77 yards, which kind of makes London and Mooney less appealing to me this week. I don't see this as likely to be a back and forth affair, which is kind of the type of game environment you're looking for with Drake London here. So I think on the other side of the ball, however, there are some intriguing options, specifically Cortland Sutton and rookie running back Audric Estime. So through the air, the game here sets up well for Sutton. I think he's pretty quietly seen 30 targets the past 3 weeks and has scored 19 or more DK points in all 3 of those games. This season, there have been 10 wide receivers who saw 7 or more targets against the Falcons, and all but 2 produced at least 14.5 DK points. And, obviously that doesn't include other strong performances like Marquez Valdez-Scantling's, 109 yards and 2 touchdowns last week on only 3 targets. And a few weeks ago, Cade Otton went for 9 for 81 and 2 touchdowns back in week 8. So I think this is a pretty good spot for Sutton. And he's, very reasonably priced at the upper end of the 5Ks. On the ground, the matchup is kind of middling. But Audric Estime is just 4,500, and he saw 14 of the 17 running back touches last week. Sean Payton came out and alluded to him getting even more opportunity this week. So he kind of presents a really strong value this week at 4,500. So he's a spot that I'm going to probably have some initial interest in. Moving on to the next 4 p.m. game, it's the Seahawks at the 49ers. So Christian McCaffrey made his 2024 debut last week. He saw 20 opportunities. Despite his time away, he wasn't limited in terms of usage or production, amassing over 100 total yards. And Seattle has been, gassed on the ground this season, allowing 99 or more rushing yards to Tyrone Tracy, Isaiah Guerrero, Bijan Robinson, and James Cook over their past 5 weeks. So initially, like, CMC is probably one of my favorite plays on this slate. He's underpriced for his likelihood of getting you 25 to 30 points. Through the air for San Francisco, the matchup is also inviting here for Brock Purdy and the Niners pass catchers, as 6 pass catchers have put up 20 or more DK points against Seattle the past 5 games. And that doesn't include scores of 18.3 for Drake London and 18 DK points for Keon Coleman during that same stretch. So, 7 really strong price considered scores in just the past 5 games against the Seahawks. So nothing really standing out for me on the Seattle side of the ball. Obviously, DK Metcalf, JSN would both have some initial interest of kind of building stacks around this game. But that's kind of where I'm at, kind of on first pass, is really more on the 49ers side. All right, and then the final game of this 11-game slate is the Chiefs at Bills. Probably the most intriguing real-life, best real-life game. From a fantasy perspective, though, I'm not sure there's a ton to like. Pretty average spot here for Josh Allen. The Chiefs have yet to allow a quarterback to pass for 275 yards against them. And that's despite facing like Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Kirk Cousins, Herbert, Purdy, and Baker Mayfield already this season. So, obviously a matchup where Josh Allen can succeed, but just not one there. It's pointing to immediate success for him. The ground matchup here for James Cook is absolutely a nightmare. No running back has rushed for 60 yards against the Chiefs or even accounted for 80 total yards against them this season. So definitely a spot I'm going to likely avoid. The matchup through the air isn't great for Buffalo either, as the Chiefs haven't allowed a wide receiver to post a 20-point DK score yet this entire season. They've been most vulnerable, though, to the tight end position, allowing games of 9 catches for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns to Isaiah Likely, 7 for 91 to Mike Gesicki, 6 for 92 to George Kittle, 8 for 77 to Cade Otton. So Dalton Kincaid or Dawson Knox, if Kincaid is unable to go, I think is kind of initially interesting. And then on the Kansas City side of the ball, the best matchup is for the Chiefs backfield, as Jonathan Taylor, Breece Hall, Derrick Henry, and Devon Achane, actually both times this season, they all amassed over 120 total yards against Buffalo. So at 6,700, Kareem Hunt is interesting. He's seeing really good opportunity. He's not an explosive back, but the Chiefs trust him, and he's seeing 18, 20 opportunities most weeks. So he's a spot that's intriguing to me. And then Travis Kelce has seen 40 targets the past 3 games. So that really stands out. Tight end is kind of a thin position, but even excluding his position at tight end, like at 6,300, seeing 40 targets the past 3 weeks, that's just such a better opportunity count than wide receivers at the same price point as him. So I wouldn't mind initially like a 2 tight end build where Kelce's one of your plays, because there's just not many better plays at 6,300. So that's kind of my initial read on it. Kind of doing a first pass at defense here. Not a lot to love. I really do like the pay up options. Detroit, Minnesota really stand out to me. Green Bay is interesting. And then kind of further down, if you're looking more of a punt play, the Broncos are interesting. But that's kind of really it for me this week. I think just from a player pool point of view here, we've got 11 games on this slate. So, when you go to look at, quarterback, running back, the 2 wide receivers, the tight end, and the defense. You've got 22 teams in play. So like 130, 132 kind of viable type players across the player pool. So I think, ideally you really want to be trying to target kind of 20 to 25%. You really want to play tight. So I think ideally you're looking to try to narrow your pool to like 30 or 35 players if you're playing, 150 lineups, or at least that's how I try to play. So appreciate you tuning in this week. You can find me, on Discord throughout the week, as well as my articles in the scroll. And I hope to see you and your OWS avatar at the top of the leaderboard here in week 11. But thanks for tuning in.